My VNC has died. Oh, there we go. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Wandering DMs. I'm Paul.
And I'm Dan. And today on Wandering DMs, what a great show we have lined up for you today. We're talking about D&D on Mars. And if you like Burroughs' Martian adventures where John Carter is groping through black pits, then you may like a little game called D&D. And so we're here today to talk about the surprisingly deep connections that those properties have. All that and more today on Wandering DMs.
Before we get into that, I will remind everyone, as always, that after our show, we do have an after-party chat. That is a live video chat with the two of us and all of our patrons on our private Discord server. You can join in that by joining our Patreon at patreon.com/wanderingdms.
We're going to look forward to that later today. And of course, so the Mars that we're talking about here today that is really, intimately connected to original D&D in ways that a lot of people nowadays don't know is, of course, the Barsoom stories of John Carter by Edgar Rice Burroughs. And of course, Burroughs is famous for creating John Carter and creating Tarzan. And I kind of pushed for this. I kind of wanted this. Neither Paul nor I are the biggest Burroughs experts on this planet. And so kind of my motivation for wanting to talking about this is we're all dealing with this really hot summer. It's a little more than 10 years since the John Carter movie was made by Disney. There's some online discourse that I see nowadays, maybe re-gauging the quality of that movie. Anytime should we build a city on Mars question comes up. Frequently someone brings up John Carter. And you know what? It's Burroughs' birthday next week. So I thought this would be a good time to touch back on the John Carter stories by Burroughs, of course. Paul, did you see that? Did you see that movie?
I watched the movie. I did. Not right when it came out, but I did eventually see it. I thought it was fun. It's a good movie.
Okay.
I've not read the books. I have no connection to the content really. So as far as just any other sci-fi fantasy movie goes, it was decent, I thought.
So did you see it? You saw it at home on a television screen?
Yeah.
Okay. Give me a grade. Grade it A through F.
Oh, it's been a little while since I watched it. I don't know. I guess it's B. Maybe.
Fair.
Yeah.
Fair.
Yeah.
I think whenever I see it, I mean, maybe this is true about any fan base. Anytime I see comments about it online nowadays, generally people say that it got a bad rap. It didn't get. I liked it a lot. My partner Isabel liked it a lot when we saw it in the theater at the time. I thought it was a top tier, fantasy movie by my standards. And I think a lot of the people that comment on it nowadays is Disney didn't know how to market it fundamentally.
Interesting.
And I liked it a lot. I liked the structure of the movie a lot. There's a framing device that actually brings in the author Burroughs as a character that I liked a lot. That's the kind of thing that would really float my boat. I liked that the movie was long, actually. It kind of gave a really epic feel to for me. And, it's interesting because some people say that around this, so, the John Carter movie was being produced like around 2009, released in 2012, which was itself the 100th anniversary of Burroughs writing those stories, in fact. And it's at the same time, Disney was also going through the motions of purchasing Marvel and Star Wars. And some thinkers point to that moment and saying, because the John Carter movie didn't do as well as Disney wanted, they gave up on promoting lesser properties. And after that point, they really basically just committed to promoting stuff that people already knew, like Star Wars and Marvel. And that's where we are today in the movie business.
Interesting. I mean, how do you know anything about how that movie got made at that time? It seems like a pretty arbitrary point in the history of that property to decide, let's make a movie out of this. And people, if our viewers know better than I do, feel free to put it in the chat. I think it's one of those properties where people have been trying to make movies for a long time. Obviously there's many Tarzan movies over the years, going back 100 years. So it's kind of an obvious thing to point to. Lord of the Rings was super successful in the early aughts. So people were looking around for what's the next big fantasy thing that's going to take off and we can make a trilogy series, which was the original plan. And 2012 being the 100th anniversary of the story seemed like a good target point to release a movie, and they got the production going to make that happen. They actually did succeed at that.
Now I mean, this is fascinating to me just from like an IP standpoint, because you pointed out to me that there was a work by Gygax, right, about based on this IP that got pulled very quickly due to copyright issues.
That's totally where I'm going with this. Let me table that just for a little bit, because I want to spend. Once I get talking about that, you're not going to be able to stop me. So, just as non-experts, frankly, to the Barsoom works, it's interesting for me to remind myself how incredibly influential they were to later fantasy and sci-fi. And so you have this trope of science fiction foreigner comes to a desert planet and has to have adventures in the face of, social conflict. And, that kind of very directly has a stream right from that directly to Dune, directly to the original Star Wars, right? John Cameron says that it was a huge influence on Avatar. I mean, more or less, Cameron took the John Carter stories and just reversed the terrain. Instead of a dry desert planet, he made it a watery planet. And other than that, though, the overall plot of the original Avatar is very similar to the John Carter plot. And Cameron has explicitly said that's the case.
Interesting.
And of course, if anybody doesn't know it, Superman was a flip of John Carter. John Carter, of course, is an Earthman that goes to a planet with lower gravity and turns into a Superman. And later on, somebody said, well, what if we had someone from a higher gravity planet come to Earth? And that was the origin of Superman. So, really enormously influential touchstone to all kinds of later sci-fi and fantasy. Now, here's a quiz. And I didn't know this until the other day. A number of names in Star Wars pretty clearly come from names in the John Carter novels. And so maybe I'm going to ask my viewers, what is the name of the top tribal leaders in Barsoom? What do you call the top tribal leaders in Barsoom? Anybody know that? I'm going to give that a beat for our viewers too. Any guesses? Any outright total guesses for that, Paul?
Nope. No idea. Absolutely no clue.
Okay, I got three questions here, and if somebody answers the first one in the chat, so my questions are going to be, what are the top tribal leaders called on Barsoom? What is the name of the large sinister spider monsters? And what is the name of the large multi-legged bristly fur tufted monster on Barsoom? So the answer, some of our viewers know the first question there. What are the leaders called? They're called the Jed, or the Jedak, or the Jedwar, depending on the exact hierarchy. But they're fundamentally called the Jed. And there you go. Who came up with Kamikaze Mark came up with that first.
Kamikaze Mark there. Yep.
Good job there. And so I think that the top level is Jedak, the second level is Jed, and the third level is Jedwar, I think. So, not exactly the same thing as you see in Star Wars, but it seems like these things were rolling around probably in Lucas's brain, and he took this name, for Jedi for the heroes. And there is this multi-legged beast that's called a Banth on Barsoom. Mm-hmm. Of course, you get the big elephantine creatures called Bantha in Star Wars. And then there's also a large sinister insect monster that's called the Sith.
Yeah, interesting.
Right?
Okay.
So there's only so many four-letter, words in English that you can compose. But nonetheless, it's kind of weird that there's a number of words, right? Interesting fantasy names that somehow oozed out of the John Carter movies, John Carter stories directly into Star Wars. So I think that's kind of interesting. Now let's talk about D&D. right?
Okay.
So you pick up original D&D, right, and 1974, and you look at the foreword, and the foreword on the first page of text, really, by Gary Gygax, at the end has a paragraph that's kind of a sales pitch of what you're looking forward to when you play D&D, and he names three big characters that the reader was presumably familiar with, and the first one is John Carter.
Okay.
In fact, my little teaser at the top of the show is directly from here. I don't know if anybody recognized it, but he says, Gary writes, "These rules are strictly fantasy." Even though it says war games on the front. These rules are strictly fantasy. Those war gamers who lack imagination, those who don't care for Burroughs' Martian adventures, where John Carter is groping through black pits, ... will not be likely to find Dungeons and Dragons to their taste. So you better like John Carter, otherwise you're not going to like D&D, is what I'm reading here.
Fascinating.
Right?
Fascinating.
And then the other two coming up after that are Conan and Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser.
And distinctly no Tolkien.
That's correct. I am looking at a third printing, but I'm pretty sure that wasn't in there to begin with.
Yep.
So that leads, Paul, to your excellent question about things that got pulled, because there's a lot of mind share, right, about the little bit of conflict between the Tolkien estate and original D&D. And there was some communication, there was a little bit of disagreement, and ultimately on later publications of original D&D, where you had explicit references to Lord of the Rings, like hobbits and Ents and the Baelor and the Nazgul and Gandalf, those things were removed from later printings. And hobbits were called halflings and Ents were called tree Ents and so on and so forth. So just a couple words, frankly. A couple words got changed. But you're right that at the same year, almost simultaneously that original D&D was published, Gygax also published another little brown book called Warriors of Mars. Maybe we can pull that image, that cover up now that we're talking about that.
Sure. I got it. Hang on a second here. Yep. Looks very similar trade dress to the original brown books. Yep. Right.
Exactly. Basically same time. Both published in 1974. And so the product here is called Warriors of Mars, The Warfare of Barsoom in Miniature. Again, you have this war game instinct. You don't have the term role-playing game available yet. So it says rules for individual and large-scale land and aerial conflict. The credits here are Gygax and Brian Blume here, one of the Blume brothers there, and not Dave Arneson, I'll point out. And this product, when it was put on the market briefly, got a cease and desist letter from the Burroughs estate, and this was pulled from publication entirely and never returned. It was just gone.
That is interesting. I find that fascinating for a couple of reasons. I mean, first of all, and I've only barely skimmed this booklet. It's I don't think anybody denies that like D&D has all these influences, but it's this kind of amalgam, right? It's this stew pot of various influences, where Warriors of Mars is clearly very much tied to one specific IP, right? And right. So much so that like what jumped out at me as I paged through it is you have pictures of specific characters from the books, right? And it's and so like I could totally see why this product is much more incendiary than Dungeons and Dragons, which just has like there's an argument for homage, right, happening in Dungeons and Dragons. Just we like these things, we were influenced by these things, but they're not the main thrust of the game. And then the other thing that strikes me as odd, and then maybe this is just them. I mean, you get a cease and desist letter, and maybe that's scary, and you just react. But I know that Burroughs wrote these books kind of across the 1931 border, right? If folks, I'm no expert, I'm no lawyer, but my understanding, having done a bunch of research in this for Conan and the works of, the name of the author of Conan, which is
Howard.
Howard. Thank you, Robert E. Howard. Jeez.
Yep.
Right, is that a lot of those works span that time frame, and that there's a specific cutoff in 1931. That stuff published before 1931 is basically all public domain at this point, because it was like a, can't remember, 60 year or whatever, some specific time lapse of this many years post, and that stuff post 1931 is more likely to be covered by copyright. And then it gets into a gray area. There's a whole window of time where it's like, well, if they wrote, if they re-registered, and you have to go and dig up, tables of registration dates of when did they re-register the trademarks, if they did. It's a very difficult thing to prove too, because it's basically you have to prove the negative of it does not appear in any any records.
I think this is a good point. I'm actually glad you're bringing this up, because I agree with that. That's basically my understanding as well. I think all the Barsoom books are on Project Gutenberg for free. So if someone is interested in digging into our pulp traditions, I can find A Princess of Mars. I think this is the first one on Project Gutenberg. You can get them all for free. And I think you're right about that, Paul.
But for what it's worth, like if I look just quickly at the Wikipedia page for the Barsoom series, I can see that there are 11 books, of which the first 7 were published 1931 or earlier, and then they weren't. And there's several. There's whatever that is, 4 that, or 5 that appear. 4, it looks like, that appear either 1936, 1940, 48, 64. So a lot of these are being republished, and then there's a whole interesting table here on Wikipedia of, like, it was originally published as a serial, then published as a novel, and then it's confusing for sure.
Yep.
And these so it could, I think, best case would turn into a very messy legal battle, right? So
yeah,
sure, with a publication like this, I don't wonder about the decision to be like, just pull it.
Pull it. Yeah. Let me. I think our friend Kamikaze Mark knows a little something about this. So he just wrote, they're all public domain. All the Barsoom books are public domain, is what Kamikaze Mark is saying. But the family also had trademark rights, and they were aggressive about that, which makes sense.
And again, as I pointed out in this booklet, you do see full-page illustrations of specific named characters from the book, right? So that's surely not great on a defense of these.
And I think a lot of us are familiar now with the rule being life of the author plus 70 years of the copyright, but I think Paul's comment about the big change around 1930 is prior to 1930, that rule didn't exist, I think, was the big change. And then after post 1930, that much longer term started to be evolved in U.S. law. I think last time I looked at it, I could be wrong about that. I will say, so I will argue, as I've done in the past, that original D&D does have Tolkien baked into it in a way that it doesn't have anybody else. It's got multiple monsters by name, multiple properties by name, and if I look in volume 3, which is basically the DM's book, the front, the inside cover, we talked about this maybe a month or two ago. Initially, this image right here was labeled Nazgul, right? And here I have the third printing, and the little Nazgul label was removed. They had an illustration. Actually, this is the Monsters book, isn't it? They had initially on this page here, right after Dragon, there was text for the Baylor. And that got replaced by this Tom Wam illustration here. And there weren't other properties the same way, but nonetheless, you're right, Paul, that a fairly light amount of editing on the names in original D&D could be removed. But with Warriors of Mars, it's right in the title. It says The Warfare of Barsoom, and Barsoom was trademarked. So that, you're right, you can't get around how intensely it's baked all the way through everything there.
Yeah. It's interesting.
But I feel it's interesting that people have this mind share about the Tolkien issue and the fact that Warriors of Mars got wiped out entirely. Not so many people know about, and it kind of got memory hold a little bit. I didn't know about it myself for a long, long time. So it's a very interesting product to me.
Now there are still some Barsoom inspired things that snuck their way into D&D, right? The one that always comes to my mind is the white ape, right? Aren't those right out of Barsoom?
Sure. Let's look at let's actually look at. I think I got the Wandering Monster tables, right? The original D&D Wandering Monster tables. This actually is the DM's book here. So I have two images there. Yeah. So here is the first page of the Wilderness Wandering Monster tables in original D&D, for people that don't have this. And you notice that you have tables for encounters in the mountains and the woods and waters and stuff like that, and a table for desert (parentheses Mars). This is the first page of the Wilderness tables here. And so to begin with, the table goes nomads, dervishes, nomads, lord, wizard, nomads, and then you start having these parenthetical entries that say red Martians, Tharks, black Martians, yellow Martians, more Tharks, and then white Martians, which are all, the parentheses is for Barsoom Mars, and those are directly out of the John Carter stories. And then if that's not enough for you, if you go to the second page, right, you have a couple of these optional tables that you might want to put in for like particularly magical places. You have optional woods, which are obviously like fairyland type stuff. You have optional swamps, which is all Jurassic dinosaur stuff. And then you have optional arid plains, which is all Barsoom Mars stuff. So you've got Apps, Bants, Thoats, Kalots, the white apes that Paul just mentioned, more Thoats, Orlux, the Sith, sitting there in original D&D. You're welcome. Tharks, Darcene, more Bants, and more Tharks.
Interesting.
And those are all Barsoom stuff.
And are those monsters detailed in the monster section?
100% none of them.
Yeah, right.
Zero, not a bit. None of them.
That's so interesting. What happened? Did they pull some stuff out of the monster section and forget to update the table? What's going on here?
Okay, well, I'll point out it's interesting because most of the stuff on this page we're looking at right now are animals, right? There's even the first table I didn't mention is basic animals like spiders, centipedes, lizards, toads, stuff like that. And there's a line, the very bottom of this page, and I am looking at the first printing of original D&D here, says animals that you're looking at up above, animals will generally be of the giant variety. Oh, the referee might prefer to have small spiders, which attack the party when they're asleep. My point being, none of these things have stats.
Gotcha.
None of the animals have stats. Not spiders or centipedes or lizards or toads or ants or any of these things have stats. You're in a zone where it's actually kind of expected that the DM is going to make up stats for all these miscellaneous animal types, whether you're on Mars or not.
Okay.
It's a really good question. Yeah,
fascinating.
Right,
fascinating.
And it's funny because it sits here, and even someone with the original D&D books, I flip over this page sometimes, and it kind of just goes past my vision because I'm like, oh, Wandering Monster tables, boring. Oh, who uses that anymore? And then someday I go, wait a minute, why is the third table from Mars?
That is
what?
Interesting. Yeah.
Right.
All right, Dan. I want to ask the question sideways here that kind of appeared in chat. Have you used this stuff? Have you used the arid Mars tables ever? Have you ever pit any players question. Against any white apes or Sith or Bants or any of that stuff?
This, sir, the answer is yes. I have dug into. I actually have used white apes quite a bit in my last mega dungeon, as a matter of fact. And because interestingly, let me just confirm this before I blurt out something that's not true. Because uniquely, the white apes are in the dungeon matrix. I believe of that batch of stuff we were just looking at, the white apes appear on the level 4 out of 6 dungeon matrix uniquely. I don't think there's anything else here. And so if I want to, and you can basically look at this dungeon matrix as more or less these are the monsters in the Greyhawk dungeon, to my understanding. And so if I want to run by the book original D&D dungeon stuff, I've got to embrace the fact that white apes are canonically part of standard D&D dungeons. So I had to think about like what should the stats be, and of course I think when you move on to advanced D&D, the trade dress got shaved off and it turned into the carnivorous ape, which is not quite so interesting because of course white apes have 4 arms and the D&D apes don't.
Yeah. So here's my exposure to this, and I'm going to pick on the apes in particular here, because as a basic player, I knew nothing about John Carter, never read the books, no exposure to any of that IP. First books I'm playing with is the Moldvay Cook EX set, and I pulled out my basic book and I go to the monster list, and the first monster is Acolyte, and the second one is ape, white, and it's the first illustrated one. We get a nice Errol Otis illustration of an ape.
Oh right,
it's just their face, but I don't see for it. Now I'm looking at the attacks say 2 claws, so it looks like they've maybe lost their extra arms in this. They just appear to be apes that happen to be white. In fact, you even get a sentence. My God, I've never really looked this closely until right now as I'm reading this. The very first sentence in the description says, "White apes have lost their color due to many years of living in caves." And so in my mind, white apes were always just a D&D monster like rust monsters or, carrion crawlers, right? I never assumed anything other than, it's just a weird extra thing that they came up with specifically for D&D, and had no idea that it was based on from novels that I had never read.
That's a great catch. I wouldn't remember that actually, because I'm actually more used to the AD&D expression where they're carnivorous apes, or ape, carnivorous. I think is the third thing in the AD&D monster manual. And of course, we had this branching right from original D&D. You had AD&D, you had basic D&D with Moldvay's work. And of course, if the guys working on basic were looking at original D&D, you have all these entries in the Wandering Monster list for white apes. They are compelled to handle that. So, do they have that in Holmes? I'm wondering.
That is
which is the one that came before that.
Yeah.
Usually the answer is going to be yes. If it was in original D&D and it was in Moldvay, the answer is usually yes to that, but I don't recall it. No apes of any type in Holmes.
Interesting.
Yep.
Weird.
Unless it's under W. I should check under W, but I'm pretty sure. Yeah, right. No apes. Great catch. Yeah.
Very unusual. I don't know why Mulvey and Cook decided that needed to be included, but sure enough, there's not just included. Like they got Otis to draw,
right? Right.
Seems like a pretty important monster if it got an illustration, because most monsters in Mulvey Cook don't get an illustration. They're just spot illustrations here and there.
I wonder how much it was like. I wonder how much it was that they gave Errol Otis like the list of monsters and like which ones do you want to illustrate? And he's like, Barsoom white apes, absolutely. Let me do that. Maybe that was part of it because boy, they were really into the Mars stuff at the time.
Maybe it's interesting that the illustration is just such a close up though of the ape's face. Like you would think the classic thing to show is the forearm, but anyway.
I mean, maybe they did that ambiguously, intentionally to like, does it have 4 arms or not? We don't know. We're not saying. What's below the panel? It's up to you, DMs. I will say, in the 3rd edition book, actually, the 3rd edition monster manual, there is an ape that is white that has 4 arms, and it's called the Girlin.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
It's a new name for reasons.
Exactly. But it's a big, giant ape with 4 arms. So,
That's funny.
Of course, if any of us, remember the promotions to the John Carter movie, the White Apes had a really prominent role in the trailer. Like they were the primary Mars monster that they were pitching in this arena battle that John Carter was fighting. So I remember I thought they did a really good job with it. I thought they did a really good job. And like I say, I had a bunch of white apes running around the appropriate dungeon level of my mega dungeon last time. And you know what? Unfortunately, I remember it because honestly, I did make a mistake by not making the tunnels big enough for them. And the players called me on it. Yeah, it's an embarrassing glitch on my part. Like, oh, very tiny tunnels are hard to get through, and here come the white apes, and like, dude, that doesn't make any sense. Like, you're right. They're very flexible. White apes in my campaign are canonically very flexible. Like a cat.
Bizarre. I'm sure that I used white apes in my games, but just because they appeared on the tables and they had stats, and I probably never gave it a second thought as to why there are white apes in the game again. I think I just chalked it up to like rust monsters. I've never heard of that monster either, but here it is in D&D. So cool.
It's because we're tied at the hip to the Barsoom stories, and presumably our primary draw into this new game form is John Carter.
Yeah, clearly. Fascinating.
Let me dig into this Warriors of Mars book, right? So if you've had the opportunity to look at it, I think it's a really interesting product of the same design sensibility within the same weeks or months that D&D was being developed. And it's got when I crack it open, it's got a format, very same printing as the little brown books for D&D, same typeface, same formatting. The illustrations are by Greg Bell, same person. Not the biggest professional of all time. And we know that a lot of the pieces that Greg did for original D&D started as tracings from Marvel Comics. I don't know if that's the case for the Warriors of Mars art. I'm guessing probably not, because the anatomy's all off. But it's it feels very familiar. It actually has the same overall format as the Chainmail book. Like it starts off with the exact same. Let's talk about scale. Now let's talk about initiative. Now let's talk about movement in a table. And it has a lot of the same, like I more or less, it has I'd say 80% the same rules DNA as Chainmail or Swords and Spells. So in some ways, if it rephrases something or presents something in a slightly different way, I feel it gives additional perspective to what Gary intended for Chainmail and therefore original D&D. Like there's a place where it says split, like Warriors of Mars. There's a page where it says split, move, and fire. This is not allowed. So it doesn't define what it is. Right. In order to know that means horse archers that can move for half the turn, shoot, and then move again. Right. You need to know from another game. And why are you even telling me that there's a feature that you can't do? Don't add that to your rule book.
Don't talk
if you're
about
it. Right? If you're presumably familiar with Chainmail, you might have can I split, move, and fire? And you need to address that because it's kind of sort of the same game.
I mean, it's very interesting, and is an interesting, I think, perspective on who the intended audience was, and this notion that I think you and I, Dan, have seen in other places as well, that you never know what's going to hit, right? And it wouldn't surprise me to know that they decided they're going to make this little wargame publishing company, that Gary and Don Kay and the Blumes or whoever else was involved sat down and said, we're going to make this little imprint and we're going to publish a bunch of stuff and see what sticks. And that probably no one had any clue that Dungeons and Dragons would be the one.
Right? They stumbled into, right? I mean, Chainmail was originally just a straight historical miniatures wargame simulator, and they stumbled into the addition of the fantasy supplement at the end as an appendix, which as he said later on was the tail that wagged the dog. That took off, that blossomed into D&D. kind of half accidental.
Yep.
Not everybody at the time thought it was a good idea.
Fascinating.
Let me look at some of the mechanics. So, so the very first page of Warriors of Mars. So this has a red dot on there. I think is interesting because I could almost be tricked into thinking that this is the first page of Chainmail, right? And the first thing that you see at the top, and I think that this is, to me, it's super interesting because it's to me the most important part of my forays into fantasy game design, is that he's talking about scale, and we've got a mass war game here at 1 to 50 scale. One figure is going to represent 50 people. And then the next column over is we also support a 1-to-1 scale, where one figure represents one single character for close-up action. And we're gonna handle both here on the same page. For when you're doing mass action 1 to 50, the distance scale is 1 inch is 10 yards and 1 turn is 1 minute. Exactly the same as Chainmail. Exactly compatible. But when you're 1-to-1 scale, the scale changes, so it's 1 inch equals 6 feet and 1 turn equals 10 seconds. Both the distance and the time are being reduced by approximately a 6 or approximately a fifth, right? And it's interesting to me because in original D&D, they write that the man-to-man scale, right, the role-playing scale, remains at 1 turn equals 1 minute, 1 round equals 1 minute. And at least outdoors is still 1 inch equals 10 yards. And he continues to defend that for a whole decade, right? He defends that in D&D. He defends that larger scale, that one round is 1 minute in AD&D vociferously. Hardcore advanced D&D players will still maintain that that's what it's supposed to be. But here he has a completely different instinct at the exact same time that he's writing D&D, that if you reduce the scale of the figures, the distance and the time should reduce proportionally. And my question is, why didn't this bit get into D&D? Because it makes so much more sense. Obviously, that's what D&D has said effectively since at least 3rd edition. Moldvay says that in his book at the end. That's what I do myself in my my D&D games. And here is Gygax's very reasonable instinct for rescaling for the role-playing game, and why D&D uniquely resisted that is a big mystery for me. That's what it ought to be.
Yeah, I have no I don't know, Dan. Why?
Right?
Yeah, fascinating.
Like our viewers know, Holmes says a round ought to be 10 seconds. Moldvay says that the distance ought to be 5 feet per inch. Boot Hill, a year later, was the same scale, 1 inch to 6 feet, and 1 round is a couple seconds, right? It's everywhere else that's got Gygax and Blume's thumbprints all over it. It fundamentally makes sense. And for some reason, they resisted it in the advanced D&D line, and frankly it doesn't make sense there. So moving on at that, you have the same, right? The bottom of this page has 2 different turn sequence mechanisms, which are fundamentally the same as Chainmail. Chainmail also has these 2 options for turn sequences, one of which is where you write down your orders in advance of the turn. And the second way is a move counter move system, where basically one player moves half, the other player does their whole movement, and the other player moves half again. So the exact same 2 options. And if you were playing original D&D by the book, you wouldn't have there's no initiative rules in here. You have to basically pick one of these options back in Chainmail, frankly. And the interesting detail here is that the written orders, the advanced written orders, are only when you're playing the mass war game. It says 1 to 50 scale only for the advanced orders. If you're playing the man-to-man game, the role-playing game, then you definitely should abort the advanced orders, is what they're saying. And you should do this more elegant brief thing at the bottom of the page. So I feel like that's another interesting kind of perspective of the debate about whether you should declare all your actions in advance of the round in D&D or not. Because here he's saying you definitely should step away from that. Works for the mass war game, maybe, doesn't work for the up close role playing game.
So let me step back a little bit here. I'm kind of curious about this publication at large, right? So this is again, we're looking at the interior of the Warriors of Mars booklet. My understanding is the print run was small. It got pulled, right? How quickly? Do you know how quickly it was pulled?
I'm not sure about that. I think it had to be at least within the year, right? It had to.
Yeah.
My guess, it was like a couple months.
So my guess is too that this is like now an insane collector's item to try and find on the market, right? This is highly collectible. Yeah, I'm sure.
That is correct.
That is fascinating. Are there battle reports? Did people play this thing? Was it dead in the water? Like what is the lifespan of this product? Yeah,
I've never seen that. I've never seen that. I mean, frankly, I actually wish that there was more chainmail battle reports. Even seems a little sketchy to me. I mean, because we're always crying for recordings of Gary or Dave even running D&D, which basically don't exist. I've never heard any battle reports from Warriors of Mars. Wouldn't that be great?
Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah, I'm super curious how much I would love to hear anyone talk about like what is the story of this product, right? Did it, was it just was it just swept aside? Like, oh well, that was an interesting idea, but it seems like clearly work went into this thing. But as you're pointing out, a lot of the stuff here is very similar to other stuff, so maybe they just repurposed and were like, okay, well, shove this into D&D or steal this from there or whatever, translate and it's fine.
That's pretty good. That's pretty good.
I don't know.
Also, D&D is exploding at this time, and so I guess as a business choice, you could say it's just not worth fighting about. Let's dig into D&D. It's blowing up. We need to reprint it and reprint it again and reprint it again faster than we ever exped. That might have just taken all their energies.
Yeah. If you have two products out at the same time and one is just blowing up and you can't keep it on the shelves, and the other one is getting cease and desist letters. Yeah, I know where I spend my energy.
And you can't get it on the shelves. Right?
Yeah.
I might not do that, but it's the right thing to do. Viewers, if you're ever in that position, do what Paul just said. Don't do what I would do.
What are you going to do? Double down? No, it must exist.
Yeah, I might. Yes. I might. I might have a business Hulk out.
Okay, so a little bit of what we're talking about here. There was some chatter in the stream chat here about, or some. I think I saw go float by somebody requesting about like, did either of us has ever transported our players to Mars or to another planet like that, right? And I'll say frankly, the idea never crossed my mind ever, wouldn't ever in a million years. And my first real exposure to that, honestly, is reading the blog of a friend of the show, James Malashevsky, who wrote Grognardia, who I know has written reports, who was playing a game where specifically it was I think it was an OD&D game, right? Where there was a major plot point of there being a portal to Mars. And then that was full of, this kind of content, right? And it's such an interesting thought, I feel like, because in fantasy, what is the difference between this portal leads to a planet that exists in the real world and maybe has some, I don't know, is different from what we know to be true, right? Like Mars is not really habitable, but let's imagine it was, right? And there's creatures living there. Okay, yep, blah, blah, blah. Versus like let's just transport to another plane of existence, another dimension, right? And that I feel like that second notion just kind of took over, right? It took roots. You see a lot more stuff in D&D about traveling the planes. Let's go to, the elemental plane of fire, or to hell, or to whatever, really just absolute crazy fantastical places that exist not in this universe, versus like, yeah, let's just go to this other planet that we know exists in our solar system, and we're reimagining what it looks like. And it's just, I don't know, there's something about that strikes me as so fascinating. That what's the difference? Why do those two things feel different? They kind of do. I don't know why.
That's a great point. And if I look at the the root of the Appendix N pulp literature, and for me, it's Lovecraft is ultimately the root. I when I initially read Lovecraft, I'm like, people told me this is horror, but it's not. It's just science fiction. Everything is in space. It's different planets that you're considering. Things are projecting their mental existence from one planet to another. And it's historically, it's grappling with astronomical discoveries at the time and the theory of relativity and things like that. Lovecraft makes it work, or he makes it ambiguous whether they're, other dimensions. You don't need other dimensions. The universe is weird enough. And you're right that for some reason, when you say, alternate reality or different dimensions, somehow you can embrace a higher level of the fantastic, I guess, more quickly.
Is it because, I wonder, and this is, I don't have, maybe somebody knows this information, right? But like, what I wonder about is how, what is the evolution of our knowledge of Mars in general, right? Like, at what point was it known, oh, no, Mars is totally uninhabitable. There's no way there could be life there, right? Like, at what point do we go, oh, you know what? The atmosphere there wouldn't support us. I don't know at what point we realized that. But certainly these books, these are written, in the late 1800s? Is that right? It's like 1890s? Is that when Burroughs originally wrote this stuff? Or maybe early 1900s, maybe? Early 1900s.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Right. So what kind of scientific knowledge was available then versus what evolved? At what point did somebody just decide, you know what? I'm tired of all these people telling me that there's no breathable atmosphere on Mars. I'm just going to hand wave and say, you're going to the ethereal plane. We're done.
Yes. There's that. I mean, and obviously, even through the 20th century, there was for a while, right? There was still a conspiracy theory about the Martian canals, right? Is that, well, Mars isn't habitable now and it's all dried up now, but boy, there are these weird lines over the surface of Mars, and we think that they're old dried up canals from a civilization that used to be there and isn't anymore. And I think even when I was a kid, there were some people that were still hanging on to that idea. So, I mean, maybe there are still now. God, maybe if we go to Twitter right now, we'll find some people are still hanging on to that.
There are some ideas, though, that I have, in the pulp area, you get other worlds, right, that are not really other worlds, right? You get, exploration into deep underwater or into the center of the earth, or, a lost island untouched by time, right? A plateau where there are still dinosaurs, right? You get a lot of that kind of stuff in pulp fiction. And I have used some of that stuff. My D&D world did have a massive plateau up in the mountains that was still inhabited by dinosaurs and giant versions of normal creatures. And I really enjoyed that, frankly. And I played with that, and I intermixed a lot of fantasy elements in that. I did have a kind of primitive humanoid that was actually more of a primitive elf rather than a primitive human that lived up there. And I believe my players ultimately did go up there and explore for a bit. And I even had, I think, the passage of time operated differently up there due to magic, right? It was ultimately sort of, I envisioned it as sort of the origin of the world, right? That this is the birthplace of the world. And so it's, it was just a strange place, and the players enjoyed it, and it was fun to go to this weird place that was different from the rest of the fantasy world, and then fun to decide, no, this place is horrible, let's escape.
Yep. And of course, Gary has the whole Alice in Wonderland series, right? That was connected to his Greyhawk Castle. That was published later on as 2 series, and I think your instinct is right, because I've got my my Monsters and Treasures book here,
And whenever we talk about this, I think about going to the scroll table, that if you get a cursed scroll, right, you're supposed to roll a D8 for what hideous effect happens with the scroll. And the 7 result is you get teleported 1,000 miles away. I actually think that's happened to your party when I was DMing at some point, Paul. And but the last one, if you roll an 8, is transported to a different planet.
Interesting. Yeah.
And at least in original D&D, you don't have dimensions. You don't have the whole planar cosmology yet. That comes up in later supplements. And in original D&D, you do have this kind of Burroughs kind of Lovecraft sensibility at the root of the craziest thing that can possibly happen is you get transported to another planet. What are you going to do about that? Well, perhaps you should go get our product Warriors of Mars, and you should start running a Barsoom adventure. And likewise, the Warriors of Mars book has a reference back to D&D. It actually says, well, if you go underground on Mars, you're going to have these black pits, and there's going to be a labyrinth. And you know what you should do? You should get Dungeons and Dragons fantasy wargame rules from TSR, which is also available in order to complete your labyrinthine explorations.
At what point does this just border onto clever marketing, right? I'm immediately reminded of the accessory AC4, the Book of Marvelous Magic.
Yep.
The only book that I'm aware of that sort of crossed the basic advanced line and was usable by either system. And the very, very first item, of course they're alphabetical, but the very first item in the list is the alternate worlds gate. And then here's just a bunch of random items: a blackjack, a laser pistol, a loot, a pocket tool, that each one is just connected to another license, right? You find the blackjack and you're transported to the world of Top Secret. You find the laser pistol and you're transported to Gamma World, right?
Is that right?
And then, the whole description, and then in all caps with the copyright symbol and everything. You find the violin case and you're transported to Gangbusters. Go get out your copy of Gangbusters. Start running that game now.
Right. I didn't have. That's great. That's brilliant.
That's pretty funny.
Before we run out of time, let me say a couple of things about Warriors of Mars, right? So it does have, it segues very quickly from this war game bit to, and here's an alternate method if you're running individuals. It's interesting, what I nowadays call solos, they call personalities, right? So a powerful named figure in Warriors of Mars, a personality figure. And you can have a figure in the Mass War game that represents a personality with its entourage. You can run the one-on-one game with men versus animals or monsters or stuff like that. They've got a whole experience system. They've got a whole leveling system. They have a sketchy map of Barsoom. They've got wandering monster tables for all the different terrain types, all this kind of stuff. And then folks probably know that original D&D has rather big sections for naval games and aerial combat that they were, super into at the time. And Warriors of Mars does too. There's actually 3 parts to the Warriors of Mars book. Part 1 is warfare on the land, which includes the whole campaign thing. Part 2 is aerial combat. A fifth of the whole book is devoted to aerial combat with the various ships and flyers and battleships and stuff that fly through the air of Barsoom. There's a lot of granular detail about that. And then part 3 is information on the special personalities, right? The named people that, as Paul's pointing out, is probably the thing you could not get around with the trademark issues. And then you have the tables at the end, which is just like chainmail is set up and stuff like that. And if I could look at one more page, Paul, if you could bring up the page with the green dot on it. So I just want to say, if you are interested in getting stats for the monsters that are listed in original D&D without stats, you could consider going to this table here, which is the overall matrix for combat of all different types of men and all different types of monsters, set up kind of like chainmail. Looks a little bit more complicated. But you notice down the left-hand side, they list White Ape, Apt, Banth, all this kind of stuff. And the next number over is Wounds to Kill, which I suppose you could say hits to kill. And basically, for starters, you could use this as D&D hit dice. So White Apes here, Wounds to Kill is 6. And I believe that the big apes, when they show up in D&D, I think they have 6 hit dice, if I'm not mistaken. one version of the Mars. So you could go here, and you can actually just take the wounds to kill and just start rolling your monster out in terms of hit dice. You notice that men go up to 13th level at the most, right? So the levels of men at the bottom go from 1 to 13, and only one person gets to be 13th level, and that's John Carter. Nobody else is allowed to be 13th level. Everybody else has to be lower level, such as the Jed, right? The Jed are probably going to be level 10 or 11 or 12 because they're the leaders generally. And I will point out that this whole system is based, chainmail is based on 2d6. This whole system is based on 3d6. So all the numbers in the boxes are to attack. You'd roll 3d6, and you have to hit this number to wound or kill an opponent. And you know what? There's no d20. There's no alternative in this book. It's 3d6, but the range of 3d6 is pretty similar to d20, so I suppose if you wanted to, you could go to this table and you just start rolling d20s to see if you hit something. Would be a possible way you could translate this. So I feel that it's not exactly the same rules as Chainmail or D&D, but it's super in the same scope, and I feel it would be very easy to take this and translate this to a D&D game.
All right. And presumably there's a way to get this. Dan, this highly collectible, impossible to find booklet.
No, you can't get this. No,
you can't get it. Okay. Well,
no.
Good luck. Good luck,
nowhere.
Barsoom fans.
Sorry, there's the one downer. If you could get it, you should definitely get it, right? But it's not. It's gone. It can't be produced, and it's not on Drive-Thru RPG, and it's nowhere. So
doesn't exist. We never saw it.
Yeah,
Dan.
Right.
With that, Dan, we are about out of time. Any final thoughts on the influence of Barsoom on D&D?
If you can get this product, it's a real treasure if you can access it. If you find it or have a friend that has a copy, you should take a look at it. It's got a lot of great supporting thoughts, I think, on how Gygax expected to run fantasy war games, how that would connect to role play action, connecting the two. Gives you some great perspectives about what was in his head for chainmail or swords or spells. Or, as I continue to roll out and play test my own book of war, I'm looking at this very, very closely to get additional texture for what the intention was and how these things interact a lot. So, and if you roll on the scroll table and get transported to another planet, why not use Warriors of Mars? It's kind of two sides of the same coin. There's your two options. You're either in D&D world or you're in Barsoom. And that was the state of the game in 1974.
For me, the big thing that I keep wondering about, as someone who's not particularly a John Carter fan, I don't know much about it. So like integrating that content into my game isn't tickling me from a plot or character perspective. But the very notion of reconsidering what it means to go to a different world is very interesting to me. I think D&D, especially modern D&D, has so baked into it the idea of multiple universes, of the alternate dimensions, alternate planes of existence. It is fascinating to me to think about, well, what if we just make other worlds that are just physically distant? Whether that's the center of the Earth or a very difficult to reach mountain plateau or another planet. And then I don't know. That is fascinating to me, and I wonder what a game is like where you start to play with that and think about, well, what are the actual physical connections? How does one physically get from one world to another, not necessarily with the use of magic?
I like this a lot. This is actually my instinct for how I kind of want to run a D&D universe myself. Yep, definitely.
Viewers, if you have thoughts on Barsoom in D&D, in traveling to other worlds, or a hot tip on where the heck to even find this crazy unpublished booklet, leave us a comment here in the YouTube comment section and let us know your thoughts, and maybe we'll integrate that into another show down the road.
Keep it lawful, everybody. We don't want to deal with any cease and desist orders. But, of course, remember that you can like and follow and subscribe to us. We're on YouTube and Twitch and Twitter and Facebook and GitHub and TikTok currently, and we have the handle Wandering DMs on all those sites. So please look for us there.
If you prefer to listen to us in audio-only podcast format, you can find those podcasts at our website at wanderingdms.com. You can also find us on various podcast carriers, such as Google Podcast, Spotify, iTunes. If you're listening to this show on one of those third-party podcast carriers right now, and they offer the ability to do so, please rate and review our show. That helps other users of that site find our show, and we really appreciate it.
We really do. And of course, huge thanks to our patrons who support the show here. And if you'd like to join them, please visit patreon.com/wanderingdms. And you'll see our couple different tiers. We get a $1 tier that gets you on our Discord server. The conversation continues all through the week, all the time. And we also get to hang out with our viewers a little bit more on our live video chat, like Paul talked about at the top of the show. So we'll be there in about 10 minutes and look forward to that. Other stuff happening on the channel. Speaking of wargaming, classic wargaming, I hope you caught our Book of War show on Thursday with me and Dan Cullinan. And I had a fantasy army with wizards and multiple dragons and all kinds of stuff. And Dan showed up with 1,000 normal men.
Amazing.
And I had to loot all of my figures, all my miniature figures, in order to provide 1,000 normal D&D men storming the beaches against my over the stream against my wizards and dragons and heavy cavalry and all kinds of stuff, and orcs and goblins. So that was a barn burner. I will be back on Thursday for more Pool of Radiance play. I think I'm supposed to be near the end. So if folks can tune in, no spoilers, but give me tactical advice, that's always really appreciated. Thursday at 8:30 p.m. So we'll look for you then. And of course, Paul and I will plan to be back next Sunday. Hope you guys stay cool and safe this upcoming week. We are live every Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. So please join us again next week for another thought-provoking discussion.
We'll see you then.